Welcome to another ADLC and Northland Social Studies video. Today's video will be on Proxy Wars. Terrorist or freedom fighter? On the screen you currently see the late Osama bin Laden. One man's terrorist is considered to be another man's freedom fighter. The statement reveals the perspective each side has in a conflict, and that the cause one person sees as illegitimate is seen as the pursuit of freedom by another. This can be seen in the actions of Osama bin Laden, where the Western world saw him as a terrorist, and he himself and his followers saw himself as savior of the Arab world. All over the world during the Cold War, as the two superpowers battled it out for supremacy, they fueled wars on the ground in countries far away. They supported guerrilla warfare, assassination attempts, funding for mercenaries, and the overthrow of both elected and non-elected governments. There were also several liberation movements going on during this time. Both the United States and the Soviet Union were very interested in obtaining allegiances with these newly forming nations. The USSR and US became involved in providing funding, military supplies, and human expertise to nations that they were already allied with the opposing power, or nations that were non-aligned. When opposing powers use third parties as substitutes for fighting each other directly, this is what is called a proxy war. And in this video, we're going to look at Korea and Vietnam, the Afghanistan conflict, and the Iran-Contra scandal. So Korea War, 1950 through 53, and the Vietnam War, 1957 through 75, were very similar. Both countries at the end of World War II were divided into two zones by the superpowers. The idea being that the areas would be able to hold free elections and choose their own form of government. This never came about. Hot wars broke out along ideological boundary lines, where Communist North was against the Democratic South. Both civilian populations in these wars suffered greatly, with huge amounts of destruction and many casualties. This led to long-term political and economic setbacks. The Afghanistan conflict, 1979 through 89, or the First Afghanistan War, not to be confused with the current conflict, started in 79, with the USSR invading Afghanistan to support a pro-Soviet regime, thus gaining a friendly ally and neighbor in the region. In response, the USA armed the Afghan resistance fighters with rifles and other arms in covert operations. At the end of the war in 1989, the USSR retreated, leaving the Afghan army to fight a well-armed insurgency, many who would go on to support the Taliban in the current Afghan conflict, Al-Qaeda, and the late Osama bin Laden. The Iran-Contra affair in 1983 shows just how far the superpowers would be willing to go to protect their spheres of influence. In 1980, President Ronald Reagan was determined to eliminate any socialist or communist influence in Central and South America, which he saw to be in his sphere of influence. Nicaragua, a country in Central America, was considered to be communist, and the CIA began funneling weapons and money to a rebel and anti-communist group called the Contras. However, in 1983, Congress passed a bill making this act illegal for the CIA or any other government agency to do so. This would not deter the Americans. The National Security Council got around this by not being named in the previous document. They then began to secretly sell weapons to Iran. This was also an illegal act, who they hoped, by the sale of the weapons, would help get American hostages being held in Lebanon free. The money from these sales was then secretly funneled to the Contras. When news of this became public, after a Lebanese magazine picked it up, it became an international scandal, and another example of superpowers trying to influence the world and trying to prove their ideology better. Although the Cold War is considered to be a Cold War in which not a single shot was fired, there were several instances in which the two superpowers used proxies in an attempt to dominate the ideological arena.